He says, okay, let's go ahead and get started. So for those of you that have heard me speak before, the first few slides, the first 10 minutes or so will be, and a few pieces in between, there will be some repetition of things that you've already heard, but hopefully it'll be a good refresher. But there is a fair amount of new material in here, and it kind of represents some more recent thinking that I've been doing and really an evolution of the work that I've been doing on measuring inclusion. Because some of you do not know me, I'm going to start the way that I always start all of my talks by addressing what I jokingly refer to as the white elephant in the room, and that's me. So, what is a white male, cisgender, heterosexual person with no disabilities doing talking to people about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I hope a lot of that will become apparent as we go through the presentation. But just to give you a very quick idea of my background, I like to joke with people that before getting into DEI, I'd already done rocket science and brain surgery. I have a master's degree in aerospace engineering. I have a PhD in computational neuroscience, and I was a professor in computational neuroscience for 10 years before leaving academia to become an entrepreneur, which was another 10 years. That was like 15. It was, let's see, I left academia in 2000, so that was 25 years ago. And then I spent about 15 years being a consultant and entrepreneur, and then 10 years doing work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I realized fairly quickly that diversity, equity, and inclusion is much harder than either rocket science or brain surgery. But I started in working in diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2015, 10 years ago, when I saw an opportunity to apply the work that I've been doing first in academia and then as a consultant, which really boiled down to quantifying the link between individuals and their collective. So I used to study neuroscience. So I studied how the brain can be composed of all these neurons that individually are very incapable, but when you put them into a brain, you can do amazing things like speaking and moving and walking and things of that sort. And I had then applied that same idea to understand how lots of people within a company, within a society, drivers on a highway, soldiers on a battlefield, how all of those could actually do the amazing things that they do that no individual person could do on their own. And then one day, as I had been going to a lot of DEI sessions because I was personally interested in it. And I would go to DI sessions at conferences, and I was always struck by the contrast between the individual stories that people shared, very detailed experiences based on their gender, their sexual orientation, their ethnicity, their race. And when it came to solutions, they were very vague. We got to dismantle systemic racism. We got to change the way the education system works. And as I sat there contemplating that gap, the light bulb went off. And I thought, well, wait a second, this is what I've been doing first for 10 years in academia, and before that as a student, and then for 15 years as a consultant. And so I got very excited about it. I started to build these computer simulations that were kind of the bread and butter that demonstrated to me that it was possible to quantify the financial impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion on companies. And the reason why I felt that that was important was because ultimately, if you're the leader of an organization, your main responsibility is to your shareholders and to your board, and you have to show that you're making money. And so I felt that until such time that we can find a financial argument to motivate proper behavior, if you will, it would be an uphill struggle. And so eventually I started my company, Aleria. And then last year, I was fortunate I given a TEDx talk that actually got picked up by the main TED organization. It was placed on their site and rebranded as an actual TED talk. And I published a book called Measuring Inclusion. I've given a lot of talks about measuring inclusion, and I'm only going to touch on some of the very, very high level concepts of that and show you a couple of examples here. But I will then talk about this, again, this bigger kind of mastermind idea of how to actually combine measuring inclusion and what I call measuring equity into a much more systematic way for organizations to manage their human assets the way they manage their financial assets. And in fact, that leads me to kind of the leading part of my presentation, which is that when I speak with leaders, and these days, by the way, the demand for our work is going literally through the roof. Like literally since the beginning of January, I've written, I don't know, 5 or 6 proposals, and I'm talking to multiple companies, and constantly every day somebody will invite me to speak or to a project because of the backlash, because they are seeing these terrible problems with the way that DEI is being attacked. And for those of you that know my work, and if you don't know my work, you'll see that the way that we approach it completely avoids the backlash. But more importantly, one of the things that really motivates me, as I said, was motivating leaders. And I found a very simple set of arguments, or an argument in 2 parts, that is very compelling for leaders. And the first piece of it is to point out to leaders that when it comes to managing all kinds of assets in our organizations, we have tools to help us treat them as portfolios and to optimize them. So for example, we have financial portfolio management tools that do what? Well, they help us to diversify our financial assets to create greater returns. In marketing, We have programmatic advertising, which help us to diversify our marketing assets to increase sales. When it comes to human assets, to people, we have no idea. We do not have tools that can tell us what will happen to an organization like this one if you magically change it from very homogeneous, like in the upper left, to various levels of diversity, whether it's a token diversity person in the middle or somebody only at the entry level or a truly diverse organization. And this is a big problem. And not only because to me it's striking that we have an asset and we don't know how to manage it the way that we manage every other asset, but because when you look at it quantitatively and you ask yourself which asset class is bigger, well, we know that in general, the budget item that is most significant for every company is actually people and benefits. And when you compare, for example, the amount of money that companies spend annually on advertising to payroll, you realize that it's a pretty big deal. Like in 2019, and these ratios have stayed fairly consistent, we spent as companies in the US 30 times as much on payroll than we did on advertising. So if you're the leader of an organization and you're not doing everything that is in your power to understand how you can quantify the impact of diversifying your human assets, in my opinion, you are failing your responsibility to your shareholders. Period. End of story. If you could take the amount of money that you spend on your budget for people and benefits, for salaries and benefits alone, and you could increase the efficiency of that by 5%, how would that impact your profitability? And the answer is a lot. So this is how I motivate people to get involved with DEI from the leadership perspective. But I'm also very candid about the fact that I recognize that there are some massive problems with DEI right now, and that there is massive backlash, which is not only causing people to retrench, but there's also now some legal repercussions that companies have to be extremely careful about to avoid being caught into some of the things that the administration is doing. And so I like to talk to people briefly about why I believe that this backlash is happening. And really what it boils down to is what I call the DI disconnect. And incidentally, I wrote an article in 2018, so 7 years ago, 4 years, 1 month and 23 days before George Floyd was murdered. You can go check the date in Forbes, in which I said, if we continue to focus on DEI alone, we are going to see massive backlash in terms of complaints of reverse discrimination, and it may spread to other parts of society like affirmative action. And I knew that because what I realized when I got into this field, and I was very interested in the quantitative elements of DE&I, what I realized is that even though people talk about DE&I, the vast majority of the initiatives, and I would say the totality of the measurements that we have, are only about diversity, or to be more specific, about representation. And the problem is that when you do that, you end up creating this kind of zero-sum game mindset. Oh, we need to increase the percentage of women from 25% to 35%. Well, that means that you need to decrease the percentage of men from 75% to 65%. And it doesn't matter if you say, oh, but look, the company's going to grow because magically we're more diverse, we make more money, we're bigger. Making the math work is incredibly difficult. And when it translates into poorly implemented DI initiatives, where we hear stories quite literally of HR departments that say things like, oh, we were supposed to give you a promotion, but we were told that first we have to promote a woman before we can promote you. Or first we had to hire 3 Black people before we could actually promote you. When you get treated like that, it's a form of discrimination that really angers people. And that's been essentially created a fertile ground for people that purposefully want to shut down DEI to essentially get massive responses from broader segments of society who feel that DEI is discriminating against them. So we are able to avoid that completely by taking a scientific approach that I'll show you in a few minutes that really gives us a completely different view on how diversity, equity, and inclusion actually work and what they mean. And to start, I want to give you my definitions of the 3 terms. And as you will see in a moment, I talk about DEI in the following way. From the point of view of an organization, I like to think of inclusion as what you do, diversity as what you get, and equity is what you want. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by these. And again, some of this is a bit of a repetition for some of you, but I'm going to go through it fairly quickly and then get to the juicy part of linking it to the financial KPIs. But this is kind of very important background for those of you, especially that have not heard me speak before. So let me start with inclusion is what you do. Why does what you do matter? Well, imagine that you have a team. This could be a team in your company. It could be maybe students in a class. It could be whatever organization. Maybe it's a startup. This team is the perfect team, by which I mean each individual is performing at their peak And as a team, they all work really well together. So you simply cannot get any better performance than you can from this team. Now imagine that something happens to one member of this team so that they are unable to perform at their peak. What's going to happen to the performance of the team? Well, clearly it's going to decline a little bit. Suppose that now something happens to a second member of the team. Not only will you lose the additional performance from that individual, but you're also going to start to see ripple effects where the rest of the team will get frustrated as they have to pick up the slack. They might drop the ball, be late on the project, and then their manager will no longer give them the best projects, and they get really frustrated. And pretty soon, the entire team's performance declines dramatically. Now, I haven't said anything about DEI. I haven't said anything about diversity, gender, race, ethnicity, but it leads to a very important conclusion that anything that an organization does, therefore the inclusion is what you do, that causes any of its employees to underperform because of personal traits that have nothing to do with their ability to do their work will impact the entire organization adversely. And this is not surprising, right? But when you think about it, it's a pretty profound point, right? It says if you're doing something, if you're allowing things to happen in your organization that cause some people to be less satisfied, you're shooting yourself in, or less able to work, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And actually kind of gave it away there by saying less satisfied, because ultimately we know there is a ton of evidence that your level of satisfaction as an employee is intimately linked to your success. And what is satisfaction in the workplace? Well, it's going to be a combination of all of the things that happen to you that impact various aspects of your work, like your ability to balance your personal constraints with your work constraints, getting compensated fairly for the work that you do, getting recognized for the work that you do, having the autonomy to make decisions that impact your work. And here is the key. To the extent that different individuals within an organization have different experiences, they will have different levels of satisfaction. And that means different ability to perform at their peak. So to me, this is what inclusion is all about, right? It's a fabric of everything that goes on in our day-to-day work experiences. And as an organization, if you are allowing things to happen that lead to different levels of satisfaction for different groups, you're not being inclusive. Being inclusive is what you do. It's a reflection of what you do as an organization. Now, I made the claim that inclusion is what you do and explained what I mean, and that diversity is what you get. Many of you have seen some of my computer simulations. I'm not actually going to show you the live simulation, but just to put it very simply, I've built the simulations that have people in an organization, and when the simulation runs, you see them moving around, you see some people getting promoted. And what I show is that when you start with a company that is initially 50-50 at all levels, from entry-level managers, VPs, and executives, and you let the simulation run, you find that after, let's say, 5 years, you're still ending up with a company that is very equal, roughly 50-50 all the way up and down. And I then use the simulation to show that if you actually introduce a gender bias, you end up getting something very different. So for example, I simulate a situation in which you give a preferential treatment to men in making it slightly more likely that they will get promoted at each stage of the company. Not that that ever happens in real companies, right? And I'll show you a very quick glimpse of what happens in that kind of a simulation. So here's that simulation, people getting promoted, people leaving and disappearing. When there is a bias in the promotion, when there is a form of exclusion, you end up with a company that looks like what we see in the real world. You get a company that is very skewed, where the majority of your leadership is male, and the number of women increases successively with lower and lower levels, or rather, the representation of men increasing successively with increasing levels. And in fact, I've published a paper with my colleague Chibin Zhang. This was a peer-reviewed paper in which we showed that with that simulation, we can capture very closely the way that biases within an organization, or if you will, inclusion or exclusion in an organization, influences the diversity of the organization. And we're able to show that just by changing that one parameter, we can match very accurately the kinds of imbalances that we see across a variety of industries. Now, the last point that I want to make before we get into the juicy part of the financial KPIs is actually the link to that, is the last statement that I made, which is about performance. And specifically, what I want to show you is in that computer simulation, we can track the satisfaction of employees. And the way that we do that is that there is a variable in their brains that normally stays pretty high unless something negative happens. In this case, the only negative thing that can happen is that if someone junior to you at your level gets promoted before you do, your satisfaction will dip down. It will then come back up, just like if you're disappointed that you got passed over for a promotion, you're going to be disappointed for a while, but eventually you get over it. However, When you allow that to happen multiple times and you look at the overall satisfaction of the men and the women across the entire company, what you find is that the men, there are some fluctuations because there is randomness. So occasionally the men will get passed over for promotion by women, but on average, it happens a lot more to women. And so while the level of satisfaction of the men is very high, the level of the satisfaction of the women is much lower. And when that happens, remember the stick figures from the example before, you're interfering with their ability to perform at their peak, which means that they're going to be less satisfied and they will produce less. And if some of your employees are producing less, you're losing money because your revenues are going down. They're contributing to whether they're salespeople, whether they're product people, whether the QA testing people, customer support, all of their behaviors ultimately will impact your ability to generate revenues. Furthermore, these people, these women will not stick around. They will leave. You have a leaky bucket. You're losing these people, which means that they're costing you money as you have to go and replace valuable employees that are leaving simply because you're unable to give them the same level of experiences and satisfaction as you're giving to the men in the organization, which is why I lead to the third definition of equity being what you want. If you think of this chart as representing a difference in the level of experiences of men and women, you are seeing an inequity. And that inequity is costing you money, which means that as a company, you have a very simple goal: identify inequities and drive them to zero. And I'll show you examples of exactly how you can do that, or in some more detail a little bit later. But it turns out that we can actually quantify that. We've built a calculator that estimates for a company how much money they're likely to be losing as a combination of reduced productivity and reduced retention rates, simply by virtue of the fact that certain groups of people in the organization have a lower level of satisfaction than other groups of people. Now, this is a very important conclusion because it shows companies a very, very different argument. Instead of saying, sprinkle magic diversity dust, and all of a sudden you'll have magically, miraculously better performance, what we do is we say exactly not the opposite, but we say, you are losing money today. You're bleeding out money without even realizing it. And that money is significant. We estimate that a typical company loses somewhere around 20% of their net profits because of these kinds of problems. And we have data from real companies in the world that suggest that in some cases it can be significantly more than that. So together, what these ideas about inclusion and equity and diversity lead to is the recognition that we need to stop obsessing about how diversity influences the performance of an organization and recognize that, in fact, it's inclusion that creates the foundation to an organization that is more diverse and more equitable. And altogether, that's what causes a higher performance in the organization. So if you believe all that, then the question is, how do we take this and use it to manage diversity, equity, and inclusion the way that you manage finance? And this is where, for most of you, this is going to be entirely new material. Some of you might have heard me talk about this idea that a long time ago, I started to say, well, managing a company with just diversity numbers is a little bit like trying to manage the finances of a company like a balance sheet, right? So diversity is like your balance sheet. It's showing you a snapshot in time of what is the state of your company today based on what has happened in the past. I'm going to also explain to you why I believe that inclusion is like cash flow and equity is like your P&L or your income statement. And this is really the heart of the analogy that leads us to understand how and why we should try to manage human assets the way that we manage financial assets. Let me go into a bit more detail into these definitions. First, diversity is your balance sheet. Well, look at the definitions, right? The balance sheet, and these are definitions that you can pull from whatever, Wikipedia or Investopedia.com. The balance sheet is a snapshot in time that provides information about the organization's current mixture of assets, equity, and liabilities that results from everything that you do in the organization. What about diversity? Diversity is a snapshot in time of the current mixture of human assets in your organization, which results from all the things happening inside the organization that influence recruitment and retention. So you can see the parallels there. Diversity is just a snapshot in time. Trying to fix diversity by looking at your diversity reports is akin to a CFO only having a balance sheet to manage an entire organization. What about inclusion? Well, I claim that inclusion is like your cash flow. What is cash flow? Well, the cash flow statement tells you about everything that the organization is doing within a short time frame that is either generating cash or using cash. And it helps you to understand how the organization's operations are running. What is inclusion? Well, if you saw the way that I defined inclusion, it tells you about the day-to-day experiences, so it's about short term, that influence your colleagues' satisfaction and the ability to do their work. And these in turn impact productivity, retention, and how operations are running. So in other words, if you think of cash flow, if you think of inclusion as being in parallel, it's the things that increase and decrease the value of your human assets on a daily basis. And by measuring it, it's like measuring cash flow. Now, we know that in a company, we also need to track profit and loss. And profit and loss is useful because it provides an overview of revenues, expenses, and net income over a range of time. And its purpose is to show the profitability of business activities, and it is useful to track changes in financial performance over time as operations and market conditions change. Well, we can apply the same mindset. And when you think about what I said about equity being disparities, in that particular case was in the promotion process, we can think of equity about tracking the outcomes for people interacting with internal processes and systems of your organization over a range of time, like a quarterly basis, semesterly basis, annual basis. And doing this can help you to identify potential disparities and to monitor how they change over time in response to changes in workplace and market conditions. So you see these parallels are very, very close. And it helps you to really start to think about people in a completely different way. And by the way, one comment that I want to make, and the book that I want to show you is on my shelf. There is a fascinating book by Peter Capelli that's called Our Least Important Asset. And it came out, I think, about a year and a half or so ago, in which he points out that general accounting principles treat human beings as liabilities. If you hire somebody in your company that will only show up as a liability on your balance sheet, you buy a computer, it's an asset, you can amortize it. You hire a person, you can't do that. What that means is that you end up coming up with what I think are absurd conclusions, like the Department of Government Efficiency that says that efficiency is let's fire half of the people in the government. I got a better idea. Fire everyone. For a very short time, your profitability will go through the roof. But how well is that going to work out for you? So you see, thinking about these a bit more deeply helps us to understand why these parallels are so important in helping you figure out how you can manage human assets to become more profitable, more successful. Now, I'm going to go into some details about how you measure inclusion and how you measure equity. But first, I want to reflect a little bit about a couple things about our analogy. First, could you run a company with only the balance sheet? Now, I suspect that even if you do not have a financial background, you will understand that the answer is a resounding no. But there is another side of that, which is that we in DEI have been using diversity as the sole metric, which means that we've basically been handing that to everyone in the organization as being what they all need to care for. So we go to our managers and we say, we're trying to hit these diversity targets. That would be akin to having a single balance sheet for the entire organization and giving it to all managers at all levels, from line managers to senior VPs, and saying, this is what we're all trying to do. Not only that, but we're trying to hold them accountable for things over which they have no control. No single individual in the company, even the CEO, is able to directly influence the diversity of a company. Just like the CEO, as much as a lot of CEOs would like to say that they have a direct impact on the profitability of the company, the fact is they have some, but no single individual can completely control that. So when it comes to accountability, which is a huge problem in DEI, we are doing the wrong thing. We're making managers accountable for things over which they have absolutely no influence or only very little influence. So trying to think about it in this way helps us to realize that one of the big mistakes we're making DEI is that we're measuring not the wrong thing, but we're measuring the wrong thing in the sense of where we're applying it. And we need to learn to measure what matters, where it matters. For example, at the employee level, you should be measuring inclusion. You're measuring cash flow. It's kind of like having your expense reports and your sales reports. You need to know, did you spend any money today? Did you make any money today? When you're measuring inclusion, you're basically saying, has something bad happened to you today? Has something good happened to you today? At the next level up, you need to roll up the inclusion data, make it available to managers so that they can see what is actually happening to their organizations, to their employees. But you also need to make them track the processes that they're actually controlling, whether they're doing project assignments, whether they're doing promotions, whether they're doing, hiring and interviewing, whether they're doing mentorship. They should look at those processes, and I'll show you in a minute how I suggest that we do that, track any imbalances, and use that to spot inequities, and then figure out what they need to do to drive those inequities to zero. And it's going to be a combination of analyzing their own processes and looking at the inclusion data they collected from their team members. The leadership should care about diversity. The DEI team at the top level should be tracking diversity because that's like the thermostat. Some of you have heard my thermostat analogy. I walk into my house in the winter, the thermostat reads 50 degrees. It's so cold. What do? I light a match under the thermostat, right? Well, the thermostat is telling me that there's something wrong, but it's not telling me what is wrong. And lighting a match underneath the thermostat is like hiring diverse candidates without really understanding why you're losing so many of them. So measuring diversity is very useful. The thermostat does tell you something useful, but you can't just fix the thermostat to make the house warmer. Measuring diversity should be the first place for the leadership to understand where do I need to focus my efforts? Because if there is a problem with diversity, that means that there's probably a problem with retention and with performance. And those are both costing me money. So top level diversity rolled up from the entire company. Mid-level managers, they look at their own processes and they roll up data from their own teams to understand how they're doing. And you put it all together and you're managing human assets the way that you're managing financial assets. So how do we actually collect the right data? Again, some of you have heard me talk about measuring inclusion. I'm going to keep this fairly light. For some of you, it'll be a review. For those of you that it's new, it's a lot of material, but you can buy my book or you can reach out to me. And I do other webinars on these other topics. But just very briefly, when we set out to do the work, and in fact, when I was doing the simulation that I showed you about 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago at this point, I was showing that simulation to a chief diversity officer of a very large company. And she said, I love this. I want you to customize it for my company. I'll pay you to do it. I can give you all my diversity data. And I realized very quickly, I can't do anything with your diversity data. I need your diversity data, but what I need to know is not just how many men and women, how many black and white, how many people with disabilities or without disabilities. I need to understand how their day-to-day experiences are different as a function of their identity traits. And that's what led us to this idea of measuring inclusion. Because in the simulation, it's not that you're yellow or that you're blue. It's the fact that your experience, in that case, going through the promotion, is different as a function of you being yellow or blue. So how do we measure inclusion? Well, it turns out that one of the reasons why companies do not measure inclusion, or very few do, is because inclusion itself is invisible. By which I mean, if you think about an analogy with health, we tend to notice when we are sick more than we notice when we're healthy. Similarly, we're more likely to notice exclusion than when we notice inclusion. There is also another very important realization when you think about the parallels between inclusion and health, which is that if you're very healthy, you don't know a lot about disease and you don't know how to heal them. Similarly, if you're included all the time, you don't know a lot about exclusion and you don't know how to fix it, which is a big problem because a lot of leaders do not understand exclusion. They don't see it. So we need to measure it to make it visible to them. Well, how do you measure when somebody's sick? You don't just go to the doctor. The doctor doesn't just ask you, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, how healthy do you feel today? That would be useless. Similarly, instead of just asking our employees how included you feel, we should ask them about their workplace symptoms. A doctor asks you, where does it hurt? My stomach hurts. Okay, so it's digestive. Did you eat something strange? So they want to know your symptoms and they want to know the sources of those symptoms. So we can do exactly the same thing. And when we think about symptoms, we think of those categories that I mentioned earlier that make or that can influence your level of satisfaction. So we ask people to tell us about specific workplace experiences that have interfered with their ability to do their work. We are very careful. We don't want to know, tell us about things that make you feel excluded, because sometimes you might think that you're being excluded when in reality you're not. Maybe it's something that they do to everybody because the company is just not very good. Other times you may not realize that you're being excluded when in reality you are because of some policy or process. So we just ask people, tell us about stuff that's happened to you. Tell us which is the main category in which it belongs. And then tell us also, why did it happen? Was it because of a workplace policy? Was it because of your leadership, your HR department, your direct managers, and so on and so forth? And armed with those two bits of quantitative information, accompanied by the qualitative information in terms of the narratives, we get some amazing insights that have to do with exactly what inclusion is like in a specific organization. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. Happy to take that up with people that have not seen one of my other presentations. But essentially, the first thing that we do is that we use the data to tell us where are the biggest opportunities. For example, we may see that in a given company, respect is the area where we have the biggest, what we call exclusion score. In fact, by the way, these are real data from a large set of companies in a specific technology field. It's not uncommon that respect is a very big issue. In this particular field, career and growth is a very big issue. And then from here, we can drill down. We can drill down to look, for example, what are the sources? Are these things due to your management, your leadership? Are these different depending on the division that you work in or the role that you have in the organization or your seniority? Are they different based on your identity traits, like your sexual orientation, whether you have a disability? And so with that data, we can get a really detailed understanding of where are the biggest problems, how many people they impact, how severe is the problem, which we can, by the way, then tie back using the calculator to say, oh, because of this problem that you have with respect, this is costing you $1.5 million a year or $10 million a year. But what gets really interesting is that we use the data to tell us where to look, but then we look at the stories to get the actionable insights. And just to give you a really, really brief glimpse, things that we see, for example, in the context of respect, people at my organization make inappropriate jokes about my age. These are like specific experiences that people have shared that have given us permission. We do everything completely anonymously, but when somebody shares an experience on our platform, we ask for their permission if it's okay to use it without, we don't know who they are, we don't have their name or their email, but we ask permission to share it anonymously in presentations like this one. Here's another one from the work-life balance. Important meetings are held when I have to drop my child at school. And here's one from compensation and benefits. I'm not paid for additional tasks I'm asked to take on. If you have an opportunity to grab a copy of my book, which is, well, actually, you can see it right there. I don't even need to hold it up. So in the book, I have a whole chapter with a ton of data, and then I have a whole chapter with a ton of the experiences broken down by categories and by other areas. And it's really an eye-opening experience. Some of it, quite frankly, is disgusting, some of the things that we read, but it's really, really powerful. And it tells you exactly where to look. So this is how we've been measuring inclusion. We've been doing this now for several years, and we're starting to see some profound impact in some organizations that have measured inclusion and then implemented initiatives on the basis of what we recommended. And I can tell you that in a lot of cases, even just sharing these ideas, and whenever we do a project, we do workshops like this one. Actually, we do a more basic workshop on measuring inclusion that really explains to people how there's a completely different way to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how it gets rid of the backlash, and how each of us can contribute to an environment where it's most likely that all of us will be able to succeed. Now, what is new, and we've only started doing this with a couple of organizations recently, is how we measure equity. So how do we measure equity? Well, I want to take you back to that slide that I've given you earlier, right? Where I defined inequity as being a measurable difference. In this case, I'm measuring satisfaction because I can literally put electrodes in the simulated people's brains. In the real world, I cannot do that. But what I can do is that I can look at various processes. In this case, for example, promotions. And I can track that to see if there are imbalances. And what I want to do is take a little bit of a side tour of how I came to think about things this way by talking for a moment about biases. Because it turns out that biases have a lot to do with what leads to equities and inequities and how we can measure them. But in particular, I want to tell you about something that, and by the way, I just published yesterday. What's today? Wednesday. Time flies. On Tuesday, I have a link. If you go to my LinkedIn profile, I'm very easy to find. Paolo Galviano. There's not a whole lot of me out there. I just published an article. I have a LinkedIn kind of newsletter. It's really just where I put out articles about some of these ideas. And I wrote one specifically about biases. And I talk about why the fact that basically unconscious bias training is now being forbidden across the board is actually not a bad thing. And I talk about the fact that there are other kinds of biases that are actually significantly more impactful than unconscious biases. And let me explain what I mean. Overall, when you think about biases, there are kind of three at the macroscopic level, three levels at which bias can operate. It can operate at the level of individuals. And that's where unconscious bias is all about. It's about the fact that, oh, this person has made a negative remark about that person because they had, stereotypical beliefs about the way that Black people or gay people or people with disabilities are. And these are unconscious or conscious, because these are not always unconscious biases that impact individual experiences from one-to-one relationship. For example, a white male manager that tends to assign more interesting projects to white male employees. That may be conscious or subconscious, we don't know. Then at the other opposite end of the spectrum, there are contextual biases. There are factors that are outside of the organization that can create bias towards certain segments. For instance, let's say that a corporate leader is invited to speak at an event. Those are always great ways to do recruiting, to spread the word about your company. Well, if it turns out that that event is in a location that is predominantly white, or it's in a sector that is predominantly male, then there is a bias that is contextual, but it's not the corporate leader's fault. Now, they may choose to go to a different event that is in a more diverse part of the country. Or sometimes people say, oh, we are from Maine. And in Maine, there are just like not that many Black people here. So you cannot expect our number of Black people to be particularly high. Leaving those aside leaves a slice in the middle of what I call organizational biases. And this is about policies, processes, best practices, systems that either create a bias or allow individual biases or contextual biases to impact large numbers of people. And these are the most important ones. And the reason why I make them red is because these are actually the nastiest ones, right? So an example of that might be a company that has a policy to only recruit from Ivy League colleges. That is actually a biased policy, because if you only recruit from Ivy League colleges, then you're going to be drawing from a candidate pool that is going to be very biased. So my suggestion, or my strong claim, is that organizational biases are much worse than individual biases, because they're very harmful, because they allow individual biases, and in some cases contextual biases, to impact large numbers of individuals. And I just want to give you a real world example of how you can understand and frame the difference between individual biases versus organizational biases. There was an article this is now from a few years back, I think this was 2019 or 20, in which Tesla was sued for racial biases in its company, in one of its factories in Fremont. And there is a part of the article that talks about this employee, whose name was Aaron Craven, who is quoted as saying, when Aaron Craven clocked into work every day at the Tesla Fremont factory, he knew that he might hear or be called the N-word. When he walked into the bathroom stalls, he knew he might see graffiti or KKK or a swastika. Horrible, horrible stuff. And they got sued, and they lost a lot of money for that. And it was not the first lawsuit or the last one. Now, this helps us to frame the difference between individual and organizational biases. Individual biases, in this example, were, by the way, not unconscious at all. If a manager calls you the N-word, that is not an unconscious bias, okay? And it's that kind of individual bias that led Aaron Craven and some of his colleagues to feel directly disrespected. If you go back to those inclusion categories, they were directly disrespected during the work. But the organizational biases in this case allowed these exclusionary behaviors to impact large numbers of people. Now, interestingly, in that same article, there's a quote from a leader at Tesla, not Musk, but somebody very high up, who said the following thing. Hey, our company has more than 10,000 employees in the Fremont factory alone, so it is not humanly possible to stop all bad conduct. What is the conclusion? The conclusion is that if only everybody behaved perfectly at Tesla and in every company on the planet, there would be no bias, there would be no discrimination, and everybody would be super happy. Now, sadly, in the DI space, I have heard that argument that if only you all have unconscious biases, if only we could fix that, we would all be happy. I'm sorry, but that's A, impossible, and B, in my opinion, completely misguided. Because we have biases and they will never go away. That's how we survive. And I have a whole lecture that I give about biases. But the point is that even if you fix the individual biases, you may have biases at the organizational level that impact large numbers of people. And you should be more concerned about looking for processes that can damage large numbers of people. So Tesla assumes that it's an individual bias issue, but it's really an organizational bias. These biases influence outcomes in three different ways. So I'm now looking at organizational biases. And one thing that really trips people up is, well, how do we find these biases? And there are three different ways that a bias can manifest itself within a policy, process, or system. And sometimes I'll say PPS because those are a lot of words to string together. One, the PPS itself is biased. Two, the PPS allows individual biases to impact outcomes for multiple individuals. Or three, there is a lacking policy, process, or system that could block biases, like the fact that Tesla did not have a policy to punish managers that are using the N-word with their employees. So let me spend a few minutes on each one of these. First case, the PPS itself is biased. Example, recruiting mainly from top schools. Well, if you're going to do that, we know that top schools are very homogeneous. Therefore, we know that this is an implicitly biased process, or in this case, it's a policy. Here's another example, offering unpaid internships. A lot of companies do that. Hey, we're famous and, we are for example, I knew somebody that was working for the MLB. They were working for a top team in the MLB, and they came to me to help them figure out why they were having a problem getting diversity by the way, a lot of people are like, oh, in sports, look at the diversity, blah, blah, blah. Well, yes, in the sports teams, you get diversity, but when you look at the management, forget it. You don't get into, very little diversity. So this friend of mine came to me, and one of the things we realized that they were offering paid internships. And the problem is that if you offer a paid internship, the only people that are going to be able to take them are the ones who can actually afford to work for free. And guess what? Those are not evenly distributed opportunities. Or another example, let's have team meetings, all hand meetings that are held first thing in the morning. You saw one of the experiences that I shared earlier. Well, if you happen to be a caretaker, which in most cases is a woman, you're going to be penalized for it. I see that a lot. My wife works for a company where they have these meetings once or twice a week at 7:30 in the morning. And I'm like, are you all insane? And when she pointed out that there was a problem, somebody's like, oh, let's vote on it. And guess what? It was majority men and they didn't care, right? Those kinds of things are unfortunate because they actually represent actively biased processes. What about the other ones? These are a little bit more subtle. Things that allow individual biases to impact outcomes, but they don't look biases when you look at them on paper. For example, if you use unstructured or free-flowing interviews when you're interviewing candidates, it turns out that lack of structure allows subjective biases to flourish. So one of the worst things you can do in your company is to say, oh, we have a neat candidate coming in tomorrow. Well, you, and you, why don't you talk to them and see what you think? And then you get together like, what do you think? Oh, yeah, they were really smart, but I don't know. There was something that made me very uncomfortable about them. You do that, and I guarantee you're not going to get your diversity. And there is a ton of evidence that that's the case, right? Similarly for performance reviews. Performance reviews is exactly the same problem. There's a ton of data, a lot of articles that show you how you can use more structured performance reviews and why you have to use structured performance reviews, because otherwise you always have biases toward women, toward people of color, toward people with disabilities. But some that are even more subtle. We all hear now about meritocracy. Now, meritocracy drives me bananas because the reality is that everybody who believes in DI, they want meritocracy. They want somebody who's qualified for a job to be able to get that job, and they want that person to be able to get promoted and paid fairly based on their work that they do and not on this color of the skin or their gender or their sexual preferences. However, when people on the other side talk about meritocracy and they talk about, oh, DI hires, unfortunately, the meritocracy that we live in today is completely flawed. Why is it flawed? Well, because who defines merit? And how do you measure it? So when somebody comes to me and says, oh, we're a meritocracy, I ask him two things. I ask him, first of all, show me on paper the requirements that you've specified to measure merit. And then show me that you've measured it, that you've correlated to company performance for the last 10 years, and that you can actually demonstrate that your definition of meritocracy is quantifiable and leads to performance improvements. If you cannot do that, then shut up. Because you're not talking meritocracy, you're talking about basically a preference of people that are like you. Oh, well, I have to assign a new client. This guy, he went to the same Ivy League school that I went to. I understand his language. He doesn't have an accent. You know what? I'm going to put you on this client project. And that happens all the time. So these are examples of the second kind of biases that are actually invisible when you look at the process on paper, but they manifest themselves in the reality of when you actually see the outcomes. And then the last one is the lack of processes that would have blocked biases if only they'd been there. For example, if your company does not have a safe process for people to report harassment, etc., like the Tesla example earlier, then you're missing a policy or a process or a system that would have made it possible for someone to make you aware of this problem and save everybody a lot of heartache and save the money a lot of company. Another thing that a lot of companies do that surprises me is that if you're not collecting data about key stages in the employee life cycle, from the moment that you're hired, onboarding, mentoring, advancement, training, and different growth opportunities, if you're not tracking those, then it's like, why would you not do that? You track everything else. You track sales through the wazoo, marketing, we have all kinds of metrics. But many companies completely fail to do that. And guess what? You can't control what you don't measure. Or finally, here's another thing that drives me nuts. A lot of times, management is the linchpin to a lot of things having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, because they're the ones that have the biggest impact on the largest numbers of employees. They're also the ones that are charged very often with implementing policies. And as I mentioned before, we should be holding them accountable for the things that they can control. Now, too often, we promote people to management based on how long they've been in the company without really knowing whether they know how to manage people or not. And especially if these people do not have any clue about cultural sensitivity, about some of the issues of DEI, about how being inclusive can lead to better performance, then what's going to happen is that these managers who are unprepared will be unaware of their own biases. They will be unaware of how what they manage influences other people, and that will have a negative impact on a lot of employees. So these are all the kinds of examples that can help you to understand how to analyze your own processes in your systems so that you can tell where there may be biases that can be fixed. So you measure diversity, it tells you where the problems are. You measure inclusion, it tells you what's actually happening at the low level. And then you measure these processes in the middle to tell you where you need to be fixing things. And so effectively, the way that I suggest that you do it is that you look for disparities in outcomes. So you look at all of your policies. So each manager, you're measuring or you're managing your things anyway, how you organize meetings, how you do performance reviews, how you select people for bonuses and raises, how you select people for projects. Just start tracking those. And if you see that, this particular group of people, I'm getting a very good ratio of input to output, but this other group, I get a lot fewer, then you know that you have a problem. You're measuring that inequity, and that inequity is costing you money. Because now the people that are not getting promoted, that are not getting the raises, that are not getting the project assignments, are going to be the ones that are going to produce less. They're going to be the ones that are going to be leaving your company. They're going to be the ones that are going to be complaining about the poor working conditions in your company. So the way that you spot organizational biases then, which is how you measure equity, if you will, is you start by creating a safe process for employees to report negative experiences, for example, by measuring inclusion the way that I suggested earlier. You need to audit your policies. And by the way, I've sometimes done this with companies where we do an activity. I've worked with managers where we do an interactive activity where I tell them for half an hour, okay, get together with 3 of your colleagues and identify one process that you're familiar with, that you have your fingers on, and thinking about the framework of the 3 different ways that processes can be biased, figure out where the bias is, figure out what you would do to fix it. And what blows my mind is that every time that I've done this 4 or 5 times already, managers will come up with like oodles of examples, oodles. And most of them are like stupidly easy things to fix. So this is not rocket science. This is not brain surgery, right? This is something that you could actually do quite easily. And so audit the policies and then get in the systematic habit of measuring outcomes. Measure the things that matter. In this particular case, when you're measuring the mid-level, look at your processes, your policies, and your systems, and try to quantify any disparities that come out on the basis of personal traits. So putting it all together, this is my expanded vision for the kind of DEI that actually leads to a true meritocracy, that leads to true efficiency without angering our government or angering leaders or angering white people who are going to feel left out or other people who maybe feel left out for different reasons. So how do we do that? We start by establishing practices to collect and review inclusion data for employees. And by the way, potentially you could do the same thing with customers. You could do things, especially if you're a B2C organization, that becomes very important. Then You deploy tools for the managers to collect and report equity data for processes that they own, and you give them access to inclusion data in a way that helps them to understand where they can help their teams perform better. What manager is going to dislike being told how they can make their team perform better so that they can look better? And then you roll up all the data and you create your diversity reports where diversity is meaningful to the executive level for monitoring and for decision support. But once you find problems, you go down and you say, oh, we're having a problem with not enough people with disabilities. Well, let's go one level down. Let's look at the measured equity across all the divisions. Oh, look, we have a big problem in this division. Okay, well, let's look at what's happening to the individual processes. Oh, look, there's this one particular division where they've never hired a single person with a disability. Let's find out why. Or maybe they have hired 5 people with disabilities and they all have left within a month of being there. Let's find out why. And when you do that, you're collecting the right data at every level. And I want to make a couple of more additional reflections. First, if you do this properly, this is not that difficult, right? This is the way that we manage finances. It's really a matter about setting up the proper tools so that you're tracking the proper data at the proper level and then rolling it out. And tracking inclusion and equity data should become as standardized as tracking expenses or sales processes. Can you imagine if somebody came to you and said, no, I don't want to file my expense reports? It's like, man, you're out, right? If you explain to them why they're doing it and you give them tools to make it easy and systematic, it's not going to be a problem. It's actually very simple. And one of the things is that it's very similar to what we already do with managing finances. So this would be a very easy thing for people to embrace. Another important point is that accountability becomes much easier to enforce and much more directly linked to manager behaviors. One thing that drives me bonkers is when I see companies that are like, oh, we link the performance, we link the payment of our executives and our top level managers to diversity targets. And I'm like, really? It makes no sense. I mean, yes, it kind of does ultimately in the long term, but it's like you're asking somebody to be responsible for something that they really have very little control over. Make them accountable for the things that they're controlling. Yes, as a CEO and maybe at the top level C-suite, you should be partly responsible for the diversity targets, but you need to make sure that the right people are responsible for the right targets at every level. If you do it this way, DI will be embedded in every part of the organization. And one other thing that drives me a little bit bonkers about some of my DI colleagues, you get these stories of like, oh, DI is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Oh, think of it as a dark forest and it's going to be difficult, but when you get to the other side, there will be unicorns. And it's like, why are we making this so difficult for ourselves? Why are we making it sound like it does not have to be difficult. If you do this, it's not about, oh, let me do it in the marketing department. Let me bolt it on here. It's like, okay, let's create a tool. Let's roll it out to everybody. Change management. Most leaders know how to do change management for their organizations. This is as simple as let's select the tool that we're going to use. Let's collect the metrics. Let's figure out who's going to be responsible. Yes, it's going to be a little bit of work, but you're doing it once and you do it for the entire organization. And when you do it that way, it becomes much easier to embed it in every part of the organization instead of the sense of, oh my God, I just had to spend all this time doing this thing for this group. Now half of the company's pissed off at me, and now you're asking me to do it for every other group in the organization. So I believe that when you couple these ideas with what I told you earlier about the fact that human assets are the most valuable asset of every organization, it means that DI will become the single most valuable strategic function of every organization. And if you think about the way that the internet became so successful, think about what made it really successful. It was the fact that we learned through the internet to measure and quantify the impact of advertising. That is the single most important reason why the internet became so widely successful. Now, advertising, 1/30th of payroll. If we can start to quantify the impact of initiatives that improve the lives of our employees, how big will the impact be? How successful will companies that figure this out be? So my conviction is that if we all learn to do this and we embrace it, and it's going to take some time to figure out all the details, but if we can do this, the companies that figure out how to crack this particular nut will demolish the competition, just like the companies that figure out how to embrace the internet are now the top companies in the world. So with that, thank you. I left only a couple of minutes for questions. I hope you found this interesting.